So Monero is one of the original coins. I would put this there with Bitcoin, Ethereum. It is one of the oldest running coins that is out there in existence. I think 2013 is when the first paper on Monero was published, and it's been pretty consistently used by people who are very privacy focused. And it's certainly not the only privacy coin, but it was one of the first privacy coins that really came to prominence. And so when we think about a privacy coin, what this means is it's harder to trace transactions. And when I say harder, there are sometimes things that you can do which will compromise your privacy. So if you stay within the world of Monero, you're pretty safe. It's not something where your privacy is going to be errantly leaked because of the protocol, but there are things you can do which will compromise the privacy of what is going on with Monero. And some people have been caught when they've been swapping between things which are not privacy preserving at all. So let's have a deeper conversation about this. Lucas, I know you've been looking into Monero with more regularity, and there have been some big changes that have happened with Monero. So what caught your eye about Monero? Why did you want to talk about it today?
Well, I'm always curious about Monero. It's not something that I'm deeply familiar with. I've never used Monero. I'm much more familiar with a couple of other blockchains, but it's always on my radar. I'm always curious about it, and especially its focus on anonymity because um, as people gain more interest in crypto, there's often the perception that crypto is about anonymity. And it's a shock to many people what money looks like when it's not anonymous. Think about our dialogues with regards to CBDCs, with banking, with money in a broader sense. We've come to a point in the world and in society where there is usually an expectation of anonymity on money. So I'm always curious about Monero's focus on privacy and how they maintain that. So with that regard, I guess that would lead me to my first question with regards to Monero. When I think about privacy on the internet, I guess the first thing that pops to my mind is Tor, the Tor browser, and onion routing and garlic routing. Is how does Monero achieve its how does it obfuscate the transactions on a public blockchain between the users?
Well, let's maybe start with the Tor side of things. So this is the mechanism that almost every single privacy coin uses to ensure that you're protected at least at the network side of things, and that's critical to privacy coins. Is you have to all of these technologies, whether it's Bitcoin or Chia or Monero or whatever, they all are layered things. So they start with some mechanism where nodes can connect to each other, and fundamentally, if you don't have privacy at that layer, there can be some level of, well, we know things about what's going on in the network because of where transactions are submitted, how they're routed within the network. And so there's a lot that you can learn about what's going on in the network by looking at the interconnected nodes and knowing something about that. So if you're going to have a privacy coin and you're going to be serious about privacy, that part of the equation has to be pretty solid. And so most privacy coins will depend upon Tor for its fundamental networking component. So Monero does it that way. Verge does it that way. There's a whole bunch of them that kind of build on top of that fundamental networking layer. So if you have some sort of a wallet that supports Monero and it's privacy preserving, then it'll need to sync all the blocks on Monero, at least from whatever point your wallet was created. So usually that's one of the tricks is you look at whatever your wallet height was and you keep track of that. So that way you don't need to sync the entire Monero blockchain to figure out where your transactions are. Because the only way to find your transactions is to look at all of the blocks. and this is a technique that has even crept into Bitcoin. So Bitcoin has similar types of, you can have very privacy protecting transactions in Bitcoin, but the trade-off is that you have to look at all the blocks to find where your transactions are. And that should be pretty obvious if you think about how these things work. Is if you know how to find your transactions, of course you can, because they're your transactions, they're associated with your mnemonic phrase, your private keys, and whatever. And nobody else can find them because they don't have that stuff. And there's no general way to just say get all of the addresses, because it's one of the fundamental things you need to do is not have address reuse within the world of Monero if you really want to be privacy preserving. So Tor is the fundamental building block on which most privacy coins are built, and that is also the way that Monero works. The next layer on top of that is, how do you mix up the transactions, or how do you make it so that you can't just say this spend went to that spend and you can easily chain them together. That sort of thing is what you need if you're going to not be able to easily figure out who is interacting with who in the world of payments. In Bitcoin, we have transactions. And so there's a block, there's a bunch of transactions, and it's very easy to tell this coin was spent, it became these particular outputs, and that's the traceability and the transparency that we have in the public ledger. There's ways to subvert that. Mixers have been doing that for a long period of time. This is where you have a whole bunch of coins that will come together. You have a whole bunch of outputs that are going to happen simultaneously. And so it's hard to say this coin directly went to that output, and it's easy to sort it out. And that's why mixers have been viewed as one of the privacy things. And so Monero has its own techniques for how it does this and preserves the privacy when you have transactions that are occurring between users within the Monero blockchain itself. And these have changed over time as vulnerabilities have been identified. Monero is very actively under development. I guess that's one of the things that's really important to understand about Monero, is that there's renewed interest in it. So if you were to look at the chart, you'll see that Monero's kind of gone up a lot lately, and there have been developments within the world of Monero. I think they've hard forked many times in the last couple years as I've been keeping track of it. So it's very actively under development. And if you were to ask, how does Monero preserve privacy, you'd really have to bucket this into eras, because it's changed so much and because it's been under such active scrutiny, and the community continuously is pushing for the privacy of this chain to evolve over time and for it to continue to get better. There have been notable weaknesses in the way that they did ring structures and the way that they tried to obfuscate transactions. And so, the first, I think, attempt to make it better was to make this obfuscation technique a bit larger, and to make it so that the search space was really insurmountable. And then I believe they found some weaknesses with that. And we can get into more of the nitty gritty detail if you're interested, but I'd say that that's kind of the fundamentals of it, is that there's privacy at the networking level using Tor. You have to get all the blocks. You have to introspect those blocks to be able to figure out what your transactions are. And that gives you your wallet balance, your spendable coins. And then when you spend a coin, it goes into this kind of mixing activity that happens within inside of Monero and the blocks itself, that provide that level of obfuscation, so that you can't just say this coin became these other couple of coins and I can just trace it back to the beginning of time and figure out who you've been interacting with, who you've been paying, as long as I can dock some addresses. So that's kind of the 101 of Monero. Is it has these fundamental features, and those features are evolving over time, and we've seen a whole bunch of changes and hard forks and new code that's been introduced into Monero. So this is a very active blockchain, very actively under development. And if you look at the chart, there's been a renewed vigor, a renaissance in Monero. I think that there was a recent hack that occurred where somebody stole a bunch of crypto. They had Bitcoin, they swapped it into Monero, and that's what kicked off this huge run up if you see that that flurry of activity that happened just a little while ago, that was when that influx of capital came in from the huge Bitcoin um, heist, and they swapped it into Monero to try to hide their tracks on that, and it's really caused a lot of interest in price run up recently.
Interesting. That was gonna be my next question, why that spike? And I do remember those the Bitcoin heist, the social engineering, another story. And I am interested to get maybe deeper into the weeds with regards to some of the innovations with the mixing and transactions, but maybe we'll have to do that in the future if we don't have time, because there are other aspects of Monero that I'm also interested in. It's proof of work. Can you tell me? And I also know that the proof of work is ASIC resistant. So what do you know about the hashing, the consensus security, the proof of work system behind Monero?
Well, you're exactly right. It ASICs are something that is very undesirable on a blockchain, and it's undesirable for a variety of reasons. It makes the network more efficient in that when you're computing the fundamental thing, an ASIC will do it with less power than anything else because the chip is entirely designed and devoted to doing just that specific operation that's required. And so that in some ways seems like it would be a good thing, but what it tends to is it creates this arms race. Those who can create the fastest, best ASICs will tend to have more of the network capacity than people who don't have them. And so as soon as you have this really efficient ASIC that comes out, it can start to dominate. And the reason that happens is because an ASIC can be an order of magnitude better. Like you can see leaps like that where you can be 10 times more efficient than everybody else. And so that means if you get a crack at those ASICs first, by having a relatively small amount of them, you can have a disproportionate amount of the network. So as the generations of ASICs have come out on Bitcoin, what we've seen is the people who get them first and get some mass of them will tend to start to dominate the network. And so that creates this upgrade cycle where a lot of the miners will be grabbing the new ASICs, they'll be bringing it online, and you'll see that the hash rate goes up. And that means you can get left behind really easily on a network where you're on this ASIC treadmill. The reason you don't want that is because you want broad participation and you don't want people to be left behind if they don't buy the new hardware, because the people who can continuously buy the new hardware, they're the pros. They're the ones who have cheap electricity. They're the ones who have the vested interest in continuing to maintain their dominant position, doing most of the mining and capturing as much of the rewards as possible. And so that means that there are going to be fewer and fewer participants over time if you constantly have to be dumping money into it versus having a broad base of participation where you aren't on this hardware treadmill. You can have a lot of people participating in the network, and that the consensus mechanism is ASIC resistant. So that is what Monero has. And it's the reason that this ASIC resistance is desirable because it keeps the network participation as broad as possible without being on this upgrade cycle treadmill of ASICs. So that's it in a nutshell. Is you've got a essentially a GPU optimized algorithm that's ASIC resistant, and that's how you do mining. It is a proof of work chain, so it's similar to what you would experience with, Bitcoin or Ethereum before they moved to proof of stake. It's that's also one of the reasons why I would say it's an OG coin is because most of the original cryptos that came out, between when Bitcoin launched and the first era of like 4 to 5 years after the Bitcoin started to really dominate the thought of how cryptos should work, they were all proof of work. So it's in that camp of came out around the time of Ethereum and very close to when Bitcoin started to gain some prominence.
Yeah, you could see where proof of stake might become problematic with the users and the uses of Monero that are being targeted. As I was looking at that Wikipedia entry, I noticed that the algorithm was called RandomX, and as you described um, the way that ASICs miners are designed specifically to match a chip to a certain type of problem, I can imagine that the RandomX algorithm has different types of puzzles to solve to thwart that specificity in the hardware and to keep the consensus participation resilient to ASICs or whoever it may be that is trying to build hardware specific to any one math problem. But and so this I also would imagine is very crucial for Monero to maintain that wide that not just for consensus security but also for the mixing and transactions to maintain that wide number of nodes um, to to obfuscate the transactions. Am I right in that?
Obfuscating transactions is part of the fundamental privacy preserving mechanisms within Monero, and it's changed over time. That's why it's hard to just say this is what it is, because we could talk about what it is today, but it's changed, and these things have been changing. As recently as a few months ago, they had some changes that have occurred to major upgrades that happened in 2022. So I think the takeaway from Monero is that you have to stick with it. It's important that you constantly are moving along with Monero. It's not the kind of a chain where it's very static. It's knowing what it is. Like it's much different than Bitcoin in that sense. And the reason for that is because the security research just continues apace. Like this is a blockchain which has embraced this notion of we're going to be privacy preserving, and if things come up and it looks like there's vulnerabilities, then we're gonna fix them. And we don't know that we've gotten it right. We don't even think that we can get it right. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna keep working to ensure that it's as right as it can be based on the current research. And that's the whole point of Monero, is that it's just constantly evolving, upgrading, and there have been even some really interesting developments that have happened. Like what I've got on the screen right now is the one of the leads on Monero has been working on another privacy chain for a substantive amount of time. And he said, you can actually use this new blockchain in Monero at the same time in a merge mining style capacity. And that one of the first times I ever heard about merge mining was when Dogecoin and Litecoin were mining concurrently. And so this is where, if you've got your mining rig set up and you have enough capacity for whatever you're doing, that you can actually mine two cryptos at the same time using roughly the same amount of electricity. And so this new chain has come out, launched by that Monero lead, Ricardo. And when you're running your Monero rig, you can earn Tari at the same time. So I don't know if it's intended that Tari somehow be a replacement, or if it just is intended that these two will live alongside each other, and that the community is excited to get that early crack at a crypto. Usually the way that the tokenomics of these cryptos work is they're very, very front loaded to their inflation. So getting in early can mean that if you're willing to camp on whatever you mined in those first days, that you can get a substantial payoff. That's where some of those 10x, 100x, 1000x can come from, is that you get in on the early days when it's relatively easy to get the coins, but then you got to wait for, I don't know, 5-10 years when the chain starts to have some prominence and has utility beyond just mine, hold, and send.
Yeah, I had not heard at all of Tari until this morning. So, um, but you don't know what the idea behind Tari is, other than being caught your attention that this was a merge mining going on.
It's part of what I wanted to research with the show, because I know that we wanted to do this show. So I wanted to go just beyond that 101. I wanted to give a sense to the community and everybody who's paying attention to this, or now that Monero is coming on their radar for the first time, that it's has this disposition. There are a lot of other cryptos that change very slowly, or they change at a very measured pace. Ethereum just had a huge upgrade, big changes there in how, Ethereum scalability might work, and so there was a lot of excitement around that. But then you have something like Bitcoin, where change comes so slowly that some have accused it of ossifying, that it's become so static, that it changes so infrequently that it almost can't absorb change anymore because of the intense scrutiny that's on any kind of a change on Bitcoin. So it's something to note when you're thinking about these different cryptos, is some have a much more fluid nature to them. Monero, I would say, is very similar to Chia in that there isn't a lot of dissent within the community. It pretty much follows along with the thought leaders that are pushing the chain along. And so as these big hard forks and things have come up, they've been relatively adopted. But I think that's also because there's a lot of scrutiny and healthy discussion about the vulnerabilities that have existed, and how to fix them, and the proposals for fixing them, because there are these thought leaders in Monero that help to shepherd these things along.
You mentioned the community of Bitcoin, and it seems to me also that Monero has a younger and also broader, a more worldwide community. What do you know about the Monero devs? Do they have the same? Do they have the same? It seems that they don't, but do they have the same issues that Bitcoin had with regards to maybe a couple of groups of developers really controlling the future of the chain?
Monero has had a lower price for a pretty substantive period of time. I think one of the things that makes Bitcoin ossify is how much it's increased in price over a relatively short period of time. If you look at Bitcoin against most other assets, it has so substantively outstripped gains. If you were to invest it in Bitcoin on any kind of time horizon that's on the order of 2 to 4 years, you almost always see positive gains. And that sort of treadmill of gaining price has put such scrutiny on Bitcoin that it's like any change to it, it feels like it could upset the apple cart in some sense. And there's these big players that don't want anything to change because they like this number go up sort of infrastructure and price appreciation. Monero hasn't had that. If we go back to the chart, I'll just kind of blow this out a little bit further so we can see, because price does affect a lot of stuff. It was just kind of hanging out, at like 150 for a really long period of time, and didn't really see any price appreciation. And if you look at it over a longer period of time, we had these troughs of relative stability. It's like here we were kind of just hanging out at like 80 to 100, but it's had these, dramatic ups, where it's like really, really interest, and then it goes back down. And it looks like we're in another one of these. But, over time, it's been relatively stable. It's kind of just had a good price, but not a great price. And because of that, I think there's been less pressure on Monero to just sit on its hands and not do anything. And it's also the nature of privacy. If you're going to be a privacy coin, you've got to chase that dragon of knowing what the current vulnerability state is, having people constantly bang on and try to break it, and responding to those security incidents and those things, the developments that have come up that have said there's a compromise to privacy or there's a weakness to it, and you've got to address it if you're going to continue to stay relevant. And so the community has been aligned that way. I think that there hasn't been as much dissent. There hasn't been these camps that, want to see a very specific thing out of the blockchain like there is on Bitcoin, where there's this resistance to having these other types of technologies in the mix. Monero doesn't have all these weird exotic type things on it. It's pretty much had a focus of we're a privacy protecting crypto coin that is intended for doing payments and store of value, and they've largely achieved that. And so what happens with Monero is a place that you can go to when you want your money to be private. And so you can swap into it when you've had some ill-gotten gains, but you can swap into it and stay in here just because you don't want somebody to know how you're spending your money. And there have been developments where the Monero ecosystem has substantively upgraded. There have been some setbacks, like it was recently dropped by Exodus, and the reason Exodus dropped Monero was it was just too hard to support it. Like Exodus just didn't want to deal with the headaches of Tor and syncing, and there were too many questions from your average Joe crypto that they didn't really understand how this thing was supposed to work, and that you had to sync all these blocks before you could do anything. Because if you don't have your chain synced properly, it can look like you don't have any currency. It can look like your currency is gone. So there's just a lot of problematic parts of it from the technical perspective that if you don't get it right, then your users can think that they've lost all their money, and that's not support calls that I guess Exodus wanted to deal with anymore. So they've said if you're gonna be in the world of Monero, you probably got to be a bit more sophisticated than the user set that we're going for, and because it's requires a bit more sophistication, we don't want it. We've also seen it been dropped by a bunch of major centralized players. A lot of the centralized exchanges no longer support Monero. One of the last big ones that I know of that supports Monero is Kraken. So if you want to try to get your hands on some Monero, it can be somewhat problematic. But once you get into the ecosystem, it's very peer to peer. It's the decentralization and privacy protecting are kind of the fundamental ways that the community exists and expects those who participate in the Monero ecosystem to act and behave.
And what about the supply of the token, of the XMR token? I see here on the CoinMarketCap site that the total supply now is 18.44 million XMR. Do they have trailing emissions? If people are still mining, does that dwindle in time like Bitcoin, or is that set tailings coming out of it?
They've got this emission schedule that is relatively benign, I would say. It had some inflation at the very beginning that most cryptos have. I wouldn't say that anybody in the era of when Monero was originally launched really got tokenomics right. I think that there was way too much inflation on a lot of crypto at the very beginning, and I think Monero suffered from this uh, just as most did. But the thing is, if your coin lives for long enough, the inflation starts to not really matter. Doge was one of the coins which had this crazy inflation. Like they were producing so many coins every single day that it just looked like that coin could never be worth anything. But as the years and years and years have gone on, it means that there's this huge pile. And so that emission of coins no longer looks that big when you think about the total market cap of something like Doge. And I think that's kind of how you need to think about Monero. Is Monero's been going on for more than 10 years here. 2013 is when this thing first came out, and so 10 years later the emissions of Monero don't matter as much because of how many of these coins have been generated and how many are in the hands of that the users of the Monero network. And this is not the kind of a thing where a lot of institutional holding is happening. Like in Bitcoin, you've got BlackRock, you've got major companies and different treasuries that have been set up where they're holding Bitcoin, and so there's a lot of vested interest in that. In Monero, that's not the case at all. You don't have big institutional holdings of Monero. There is no desire to do that whatsoever. So this is an extremely decentralized chain. It's decentralized from the perspective of mining. It's also decentralized in the perspective of how it's distributed and held. So, the way that these coins are produced, they're produced by mining, they're produced by block rewards, and mostly, this currency is held by the people.
And what about the non-fungible aspect of blockchains? Has there been a move toward colored coins, toward ordinals, anything of the like on Monero blockchain, or does the privacy focus of it keep that as anathema?
I just don't think that there's been any real desire for that. I haven't heard of any. If they do exist, they're so nascent that it doesn't really matter. I personally have not sought out anything like that, and I keep pretty good tabs on Monero, and I haven't heard anything to that effect. So I think a lot of those exotic coins, colored coins, stable coins, none of that really exists on Monero with any real popularity. I know that there's been some DeFi things that have been thought up that have been proposed. There is the ability to do some amount of, smart contract programming inside of Monero, but it just really hasn't been the thing that's been focused on. Mostly the developments and the technology have all been at the let's preserve privacy and let's make sure we're really good at that versus let's have some diversity within the ecosystem and diversity within what you can do on the chain. Singular focus, doing it well, but constantly upgrading and changing to make sure that it does what it's supposed to do over time. That's kind of the mindset and the thing that you can think about with Monero.
And how large is the database?
Well, see, you usually don't have to sync the entire thing. So whenever you think about this, you really just start from some wallet height and you just need to get up to sync with the tip. But I think it's kind of on the order of the size of Bitcoin. It's not massive, but it's not small. You need hundreds of gigs to be able to sync the database. It's not tiny, but it's not insurmountable.
I wondered if it might be quite a bit smaller, but larger than I was expecting. What sort of wallet do you use to interface with Monero?
Well, I lost my wallet. I was using Exodus pretty consistently. That was my wallet to use for Monero, and I definitely found all of the problems that everybody else was having. The number of times that my Monero balance was at zero, and I had to dump all my blocks and resync, and it took 2-3 days for it to fully sync and get all the blocks over the Tor network. So you would see it syncing blockchain. And the other thing that's really irritating about how that would work is you'd have to keep the Exodus wallet open and unlocked for hours and days for it to finally sync and get your whole balance. And so I was getting pretty frustrated with it because I don't know why it would forget or lose its mind about whether it had all the blocks and how to find my current correct balance. Like it frequently had these issues with it. So I don't know if it's just that the Exodus developers didn't want to spend any more time trying to get this right. So I think there's a specific wallet that they pointed everybody at. Cake is coming to mind, but let me look that up quick.
Going back to the merge mining Tari blockchain, I wonder if it has anything to do with those problems with Monero, and they're thinking of some sort of mirrored younger version of the chain.
Yeah, I've confirmed that Cake is the one that I think they pointed everybody at. And so if you're looking for a new Monero wallet, this is one of them.
Well,
Cake is also the one that has that cool Bitcoin privacy preserving payment type in there. So if you're interested in saying what was that privacy thing that exists inside of Bitcoin, then Cake is where to go look.
I think that pretty much sums up the things about Monero that I was most curious about. Are there any other aspects of Monero that come to mind that we didn't cover?
I think this is a good introduction to it. It's certainly a place to start. We talked about where its origins are, how old it is, what it's like to mine it, the mechanisms whereby privacy is preserved, and also that these are changing over time. And so, if you want to know about Monero, you've got to look at it with a eye towards it's been changing. It's been changing a lot, even within the last couple of years, and it will continue to change in the future. So if you learn about Monero and you get really good at it, if you don't keep up with it, then you're going to be out of date with whatever's happening currently. So you got to stick with it. You've got to upgrade frequently. You need to really stay focused on upgrading the software, because there are these hard forks that will come in and will leave you behind if you're not paying attention to it. And it's a very accessible type of crypto. So yeah, I think it's one to keep an eye on. It's definitely one of my favorites. Always has been a favorite of mine. And Cake Wallet is where you need to go if you're saying Exodus abandoned me. What do I need to do now? Definitely a very popular wallet, one that a lot of people really, really like. And it's got a bunch of other privacy tech in there that you can play around with. So definitely check out Cake Wallet, one of my also favorite wallets to use.
Well, thank you for the basics of Monero. See you next time.